Tim Hague Reads Books, presented by Tim Hague. You may remember Survivors and Blake 7. You may even remember that they were created by Terry Nation. But Terry Nation's immortality will always be tied up with the invention of the Daleks. Alwyn W. Turner has written a lively and fascinating account of Terry Nation's times and career, from his radio days with Ted Ray and Tony Hancock through the glory years of The Saint, The Avengers and countless others. Tim chased Alwyn through a petrified forest towards a steel-covered city while a doomsday bomb ticked its countdown to oblivion, pausing in an abandoned quarry to chat about why Terry Nation's television shows got under your skin.
This is Tim Hague Reads Books, and I'm reading The Man Who Invented the Daleks. I doubt there's anybody of my generation who doesn't know that that man was Terry Nation, because if you are of my generation, you were sitting there watching them, clutching your dad's knee and being frightened to death by them. The book is written by Alwyn Turner, and you weren't in that situation, because you weren't here back then, were you, Alwyn?
No, I wasn't. The first I heard of Terry Nation was actually in context with Tony Hancock, who I grew up listening to and was a great fan of, and I knew that Terry Nation had written the first shows that Hancock did after he left the BBC and Galton and Simpson, and so I knew his name from that, and I think that was part of what intrigued me about this as a project, was how you went from writing comedy for Hancock and Frankie Howerd and Eric Sykes and all these great people into scaring the life out of generations of small children.
Well, that's right, because of course before Terry Nation got into writing for television, he wrote for radio, which was, for a long time, the dominant broadcast medium. And we've got, I mean, you've got him associated with Ted Ray. He worked for Spike Milligan's company, didn't he? I think Spike gave him his first break.
Yes, Spike took him and his then writing partner in and gave them some chances to write stuff. And he didn't really write a great deal for Spike himself, but they were part of the kind of factory that was turning out scripts for everybody at that stage. And as I say, people like Ted Ray, who's not that well remembered now, but was a huge star at the time.
It was such a completely different world. One of the main things we get out of reading your book and learning about how Terry Nation got into the business and progressed in the business is that he would never have been able to break in these days. The way it happened for him.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think right the way through his career, there's that element that you feel when you go back to it. What a wonderfully innocent time this was, when people would commission series on the strength of very, very little.
And not just that, but the sort of makeshift approach to doing everything. You've got a marvellous story about him getting involved as Hancock's scriptwriter, and then Hancock's doing a tour of the country and doing shows here and there, a week here and there. Takes Terry Nation with him for his scriptwriter, won't use any of the material, but insists on sharing a room with him.
Well, I think that was actually probably his main contribution to Hancock's career. Was he did write a couple of the TV episodes, but he was supposed to be on tour with him for having written his live material. But Hancock was a terribly neurotic, nervous man who got very scared of new material and tended to junk it at the last minute and go back to the stuff that he had been doing for years on the musical circuit. And Nation was really there, I mean, in his own words, as a babysitter. I mean, he was, and Hancock would sit up all night drinking and talking and rambling about the world, and Nation just kind of shared.
Do you think he was ever a very good comedy writer?
I don't think very good, no. I mean, I think he was never going to be the equal of Spike or Eric Sykes or Galton and Simpson. I mean, it was a time when there were some incredibly good writers around. Johnny Spate as well. These people were great writers, and he was never going to be a great comedy writer. He was always second division, really.
Well, I was going to propose that. I mean, we're going to go on to talk about the Daleks, of course we are, and of Survivors and Blake 7 and all these other things that he wrote. And I can remember seeing a lot of these things, and I can remember not necessarily being very impressed with the writing, but I remember them. Mm-hmm. And I saw a lot of TV back then that's completely gone. Yeah. And yet I remember actual details from some of Terry Nation stuff. And I think that's his secret, isn't it? That he does manage to get inside you.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, even when he was onto his own stuff, and it was the fields that he became famous for writing in, technically, objectively, they're not necessarily the best scripts that have ever been written. but they are incredibly compelling. I mean, he was a very good storyteller. And if the dialogue's sometimes a bit on the clunky side, and he's not really that interested in developing characters, and there's sometimes inconsistencies and repetitions and so on, it kind of doesn't matter. You want to keep on watching, and there will be images that will stay with you.
He wasn't. He didn't think the Daleks was going to be the big thing, did he? When he started, he was writing something else when he was commissioned.
Indeed,
to write
yeah.
the
I mean,
Daleks.
to start with, he turned down the offer to write the Daleks stuff because he was on tour with Hancock, and he felt it was beneath his dignity to be writing kids' TV anyway. And then Hancock and he fell out. He stormed out, and on the train back to London, he suddenly realised he didn't have a job. So he hurriedly phoned his agent and found that the offer was still on the table, so he thought he'd do that. But in between accepting the idea of writing a series for Doctor Who and actually writing it, he got offered the job of writing for a show that was starring Eric Sykes, which was the important thing.
And again, I mean, Eric Sykes, huge figure in
absolutely,
in
yeah,
comedy.
and one of the best writers has ever been as well. But obviously, he was getting so much work that he needed other people to write some bits for him. And that was the important thing as far as Nation was concerned. He had this big show coming up with Eric Sykes, and so he had a week to knock out the first Dalek story, and he did it in a week, writing a script a day, an episode a day rather, and thought no more of it. Yeah, that was it. He sent it off to the BBC. They accepted it, and he ignored it.
But it wasn't scheduled
it.
to be the as early in the series either. Again, I hadn't realised. You see, I know lots about this. I remember reading a book when I was about 12 by Terence Dix and Malcolm Fulk.
Malcolm Hull.
Yeah, about the making of Doctor Who. By the way, really useful. I've been impressing people with my knowledge since I was 12 on the basis of that book. But what they don't tell you in that book is that it was going to be like the fifth adventure for Doctor Who, and they had to move it forward.
Yeah, there's a story that fell out of the schedules, and it was the only script they had available, and filming was just about to start, and so they had to go with it.
And the Daleks made Doctor Who. We wouldn't. I don't think we'd have Doctor Who now if the Daleks had not been the hit
I think that's generally accepted as yeah. It was the ratings weren't very good for the first storyline in Doctor Who. There were a lot of people at the BBC weren't that convinced by it as a concept in the first place, and quite a few would have been happy to see the back of it. And then the second story came on, and it was Terry Nation's Daleks, and the ratings shot up.
Yeah,
and overnight, I mean, literally overnight success.
So I understand. Since I was 12, I know that it went from something like 5 million to 12 million in 1 week or something.
But yeah, not quite that extreme. But it was a huge leap that did establish Doctor Who as the regular fixture that it then became.
How much credit does Terry Nation deserve for the Daleks? He wrote them, but what we see on the screen was designed by Raymond Cusick.
It was, yeah.
The voice was designed
Absolutely,
by somebody.
yeah.
How much credit does Terry Nation deserve?
I think all of it, frankly. But then I guess I would say that. But I think there was Ray Cusick's design, which was then realised by other people. There was the voices. There was the script editor, I think is not always given credit, David Whittaker, who tightened up the speech patterns a lot for the Daleks.
Yeah, because they were quite chatty to begin with.
The Nation script was not... It didn't have that kind of staccato rhythm that you expect from the Daleks. And all these people, and the operators indeed, who did a fine job of doing it, and the artists who did the voices... There's a lot of people involved in it because that's what television is. It's a collaborative medium, and inevitably there's lots of people in there. On the other hand, my argument would be that you could take any one of those out and the Daleks would still exist. They'd be slightly different, but they would still be the Daleks. If you take Terry Nation out of the equation, nothing exists at all. And that seems to me that's the relevant bit.
And he did have that central insight that all television monsters up to then had been a man in a suit. That's what
Absolutely,
struck me
yeah.
because I was watching it the day it went out back in 1963. I was very little then, but I was actually watching that show then, and it was that suddenly there were these television monsters which didn't look like a man in a suit.
Absolutely, yeah.
For the first time ever.
And they didn't look like robots. I mean, I know technically they're not because there's an organic life form within and so on, but they don't actually look like robots. Robots up to that point looked like imitation human beings. That was the whole point of them, was to get them as close to human shape as possible.
Like in Fritz Lang's Metropolis.
Yeah, absolutely. And the American sci-fi movies of the 50s were very much human-shaped robots. And that was in Nation's script, is they don't have legs. They glide across the floor. And that's a huge contribution to it that then shapes what the designer then does. And so I say, if you take Terry Nation out of it, then nothing like that exists at all. The Daleks simply aren't there. And I don't know, I've compared it to the records of the Beatles. If you take Lennon and McCartney out, then there's nothing there, which doesn't say that George Martin doesn't make a contribution as a producer, or Norman Smith as the engineer, or whoever, the arrangers of the various things. Everybody makes a contribution, but still there has to be the original inspiration and the material to work from.
The story of the name, again, I've carried that for years, but you've exploded where the name came from, the Daleks.
Oh yeah, well, it was a story that Nation himself put about, that he got it off the spine of an encyclopedia. Yes, indeed. Well, it's one of the things about Terry Nation is that in his interviews he did tend to tell a good story, and if it weren't entirely factually based, he didn't really worry too much about that. So he made up this story that he'd got it off the spine of an encyclopedia that was down to Lek. He admitted, about 10 years after that it was a load of nonsense. But the story,
good story though, because
it's a great story, and it survived. That when he died in the late 90s, I mean, the obituaries, many of them included that story, even though it was 20 or more years since he had said it wasn't true. It still survived because it's a better story than it just came into his head, which is the truth, that it just happened.
You say in the book that the Daleks are an image. It's a creation that has completely outgrown and outlived its origin. In the same way that Frankenstein's monster, has taken on, as it were, a life of its own.
Yeah.
And that's true of the. You could almost do anything with the Daleks. They did. I mean, the merchandising, and of course, BBC Enterprises was formed largely to accommodate the new revenues that were coming in from merchandising.
Well, that's off into this extraordinary piece of luck that he had, that the contract he signed didn't assign copyright to his work, and toy manufacturers and the like started coming to the BBC after the series was aired, saying, "We want to do a Dalek toy." They had to negotiate a deal, but and they agreed that Nation and the BBC would take a 50% cut each. And he became incredibly wealthy on the strength of merchandising rather than writing.
And nowadays, that sounds like a terrible omission by the BBC, but of course, they hadn't had a Dalek before. There had been nothing that you could merchandise in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the concept of merchandising on that kind of scale, obviously there've been bits, but nothing anywhere like the Dalek mania craze that swept the nation in 1964. But also, they weren't used to the idea of freelance writers. Normally that would have been, if it had been a year before, it would have been written by a staff writer at the BBC, who therefore obviously wouldn't be entitled to copyright because he would have been on the payroll.
Not part of this story, but exactly the same reason that Delia Derbyshire didn't become rich when she realised Ron Grainer's music for the theme tune, because Ron Grainer had a royalty on it, and Delia Derbyshire was an employee of the BBC, and she never. In fact, he tried to give her half the royalties, and the BBC wouldn't let her.
Yeah,
wouldn't let her take it.
Which is part of going back to who created the Daleks. Part of the issue was people like Ray Cusick, who clearly had a big hand in shaping the things. What was on the BBC staff, and he eventually received an ex gratia nominal little payment for having done this, but he didn't share in the benefits of it. And Nation did, but it was unexpected, unprecedented, and just pure luck that Nation ended up with this extraordinary cash.
And it made him rich.
Yeah.
and put him in a position to, well, for anybody else to do exactly what he wanted. Of course, what he wanted was to be a successful television writer, and he pursued all these other avenues. I mentioned earlier on that you remember the things that Terry Nation wrote. I had no idea that he'd written What a Whopper, that movie that was
the Adam Faith film. Yeah,
the Adam Faith film, which was, what year was that?
Oh, that was what, 61?
Gosh, what so long ago was that?
61,
now,
62?
I saw that on television 35 years ago, and have not seen it since, and remember it. That's the point about Terry Nation.
Yeah, and it's not a great movie.
No, it's not a great movie. It was a terrible movie.
It's not even a great Adam Faith movie. It's not a great rock and roll movie. It's not a great comedy. But it is still...
That cheesy shot at the end.
Some fantastic... Yeah, and the ending is fantastic with the monster.
Loch Ness Monster, which looks like a cardboard cutout rising out.
But it has some lovely little cameos in it. You know, there's Spike Milligan and Charlie Hawtrey and some very fine actors in it.
And you remember it.
Yeah.
So... let's talk then about the other things that he did, because he wanted then to write other things. He desperately wanted to write his own serials, didn't he? Desperately wanted to get the credit.
I mean, to go back to the beginning of the Daleks, having written the Daleks, having done the Eric Sykes show, that he'd seen as taking precedence, he was actually trying to get onto the writing team for The Saint. That was what was important to him, because he loved that stuff. He loved the old 30s thrillers, and he wanted to be part of that. And so he was writing all that stuff that, you know, in the 60s. Whilst he was writing the Daleks, he was also doing The Saint and The Baron, and then later
I have
on,
no idea of The Baron. I've never seen it.
It's not a very well remembered series, to be honest, and
it's a shame because it sounds interesting.
It's great. I think they're lovely scripts. I think they're really good. It lacks a lot because it doesn't have a very charismatic lead performance. You know, that's what lifts The Saint, is the fact that Roger Moore is such a fine actor, and he keeps it in your mind. And he's the definitive version of The Saint. The Baron was never quite in the same league, even when they were just books. The Baron was always kind of slightly behind the likes of The Saint. And the series has been largely forgotten, I think, probably, but unfairly, because it is a nice action-adventure show.
The big ones then that he wrote, I mean, because he wrote for everything. He wrote for all sorts of series. But the ones that bore his name then were The Survivors and Blake's 7.
Yeah. The Survivors and Blake's 7 are the two that he created after. Yeah.
Now, again, with The Survivors, it was just called Survivors. I keep wanting to give it the definite article. With Survivors, I saw it at the time and remember it. I remember details from it. And one of the things I remember very clearly is that the first series was a lot more interesting than the second, which he didn't write.
I think that's true, yeah. No, he left at the end of the first series.
And then they turned it into a soap opera.
It was not there are still some very good episodes in the second and third seasons, but it is the first one that I think is better.
That's a great idea. It really formed a large part of my expectations of narrative, is what happens if this, and Survivors is premised on the idea that most of the world's population is killed off by a disease, and then the few who are left have to try and make a new sense of the world, and that had an enormous impact. That's a terrific idea. It's not actually a terribly original idea. In some ways,
absolutely.
But the treatment was original.
It's been done before and been done since.
Well, almost everything that Terry Nation did had been done before in some way.
No, absolutely. I mean, even with the Daleks, you can see the precedents. You can see which H.G. Wells books he's read and that he's drawing on. You know, there's always influences from outside.
Reading your book, by about the 15th reference to the Caves of Steel, the Isaac Asimov book, but you're right. He tended to repeat himself.
Yeah,
he tended to go back to his sources over and over and over.
Yeah,
and again, you make the point that it was a pre-DVD age. If he repeated something 10 years later on television, that audience would not remember what he'd done before. It didn't matter so much.
I think that's very important to remember, because it is one of the criticisms that's levelled at him, is that he did repeat plot lines and concepts and images. It's a complaint that has arrived more recently. It wasn't voiced at the time.
No, because if you missed Doctor Who in 1966, you'd missed it.
Yeah, they didn't repeat. I mean, when you say that you saw Survivors just once when it was on, that's because it was never repeated. I mean, it's as far as I know, I don't think it has ever been repeated. It's out on DVD and it was out on video, but it didn't get a repeat showing at the time, and yet it stayed with with people. A lot of people remember that show because it was popular at the time. But then a lot of stuff that gets discarded by your memory. And as you say, it's the power of those images does stick with you. There are episodes that you just can't quite get rid of.
There are, and similarly in some ways with Blake 7. Blake 7 is almost moving into the slightly modern era of television, though. You can see it beginning to be part of modern television, but of course, Terry Nation was one of the influences on creating modern television.
Indeed, yeah.
The arc of a narrative going through a series, as you point out, was not invariably the case in.
No, I mean it was a new concept at that stage. I mean, normally what you did was you made a series that had very discrete episodes, so they could be shown in any order. And the idea of having a narrative arc that stretched right across the entire 13-episode series was not really a very good idea.
But you can't imagine X-Files made in any other way.
Absolutely, yeah. No, it became standard. But as you say, he helped shape this, and he did with a lot of it. And one can concentrate too much on what he was influenced by and where he got ideas from, without and lose sight of the fact that he was also breaking a lot of new ground.
How important was Blake 7? That was the one that established this arc of narrative and the cliffhanger endings, which again, or cliffhanger endings for a series.
Yeah.
For a season, they call it, a season cliffhanger, which again was an innovation then. How important is Blake 7?
Well, I think that in itself is a huge contribution to the shape of popular television as we know it now. That wasn't around. The idea of a cliffhanger obviously had been. I mean, that was the basis of all those Republic SF movie series back in the 30s, and all the Dan Dare and stuff had always had cliffhangers. But the idea of leaving it at the end of a 13-week series, knowing that you weren't going to come back to it for another 9 months. Well, that took a certain amount of courage, that you left people hanging for that amount of time. And
killed people off all of it, because it was Blake's 3 by the time it finished.
Well, indeed. Well, I mean, by the third season, it wasn't Blake, which was really a huge thing. The idea that, this
Janet Leigh in Psycho being killed off, isn't it? You don't expect your lead character to be.
Yeah. And this is, we're now talking in the days since Taggart, when it's not unheard of anymore. But at that stage, I don't think there's a precedent for the title character disappearing from a series and the series just carrying on with the same title as though nothing had happened. But that was largely because the actor playing Blake wished to leave. But he was also capable of killing off characters. Halfway through the second series, one of the originals was killed.
Charlie Sheen on him, did he?
Indeed, yeah. You didn't wait for that. He wanted to get that element in Blake 7 particularly of a sense of danger, that you couldn't just assume that your favourite characters were going to stay around. They could get killed because that was the nature of the storyline.
Because in a James Bond film, you know that James Bond is going to be alive and priapic at the end, in the final scene. You know he is. So no matter what danger he is in, it's very hard to get any real sort of sense of tension about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a disaster movie in the classic 70s tradition. You can spot which ones are going to live and which ones aren't from the first reel. It's fairly clear who's going to be there. You couldn't with Blake 7. You had no idea who was going to live and die.
What's the best writing that Terry Nation ever did? What do you cherish most of his?
I think technically the best stuff is the first 3 episodes of Survivors, which form a single narrative. He doesn't use cliffhangers at all. It just runs straight through, and that amounts to 2.5 hours, I guess, of television with a single a single driving plot line. I mean, there's several threads that then gradually coalesce.
Not like him as well, because he wasn't one for the long haul, wasn't Terry Nation? He found doing sustained things quite hard, didn't he? He liked to sort of punch you on every page and give you something.
Yeah, but on Survivors, he let himself spread a lot more, and is a slower development of things, and there are long bits where people stand around talking without without there being
Without
ticking bomb.
a ticking bomb.
Which is his normal way around these things.
That's the thing, though. He used the same things over and over. Running through a petrified forest all the time. The city covered in a steel bubble, and all the things that he used over and over and over. And it doesn't seem to have slowed him up at all. That he.
No, well, and a lot of it is stuff that he got from what he read and what he watched when he was young. I mean, he was a big Alfred Hitchcock fan, and there's that great quote of Hitchcock where somebody said to him, "How long should you show a kiss for on screen?" And he said, "It doesn't matter as long as there's a ticking bomb under the chair." And he took that very literally. That was what you did. If there wasn't enough tension, then you'd have a countdown going on, and something would be ticking away, and you knew that there was danger involved. But with Survivors, he turned his back on that to some extent, and created this much slower and rather disturbing piece, and part of which is that there's no incidental music in it, which wasn't his decision. It wasn't. It was just an accident of the filming. It
was a strike, wasn't there?
Yeah, and therefore the schedule got much tighter, and they didn't have time.
But a happy accident.
It absolutely, because you get these long shots of deserted English countryside with no music, and it becomes really rather unsettling because it's not what you're expecting, and that was one of the things that changed with when they did a remake of it a couple of years ago, and filmed it in a modern style, which does have music virtually all the way through, and there's a much more created sense of tension. You can feel somebody directing you, and I can see the point of that. But I think people who know the original slightly regretted that it punched it up too much rather than just letting things take their own course.
In the end, it's the Daleks, though. The Daleks are what are going to be forever associated with his name. And the Daleks are Terry Nation's immortality.
Yeah, absolutely. And it happens rarely that somebody creates something that lasts that long. You say Frankenstein's monster, or Sherlock Holmes or Dracula. The people who created these things don't tend to do it a second time. I mean, Conan Doyle to some extent with Professor Challenger, but even that, I think, largely fading. It is rare to be to create something that has that longevity and that power, and that will outlast you and will be taken on by other people and taken in new directions.
The book is The Man Who Invented the Daleks, The Strange Worlds of Terry Nation by Alwyn Turner. It's £20. It's out now from Aurum, and cracking good read. Thank you, Alwyn.
Thanks very much.
That was Tim Hague Reads Books, presented by Tim Hague. Tim Hague Reads Books is a Green Shoot production. More details can be found at www.green-shoot.com, or Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.